Hi, this is a short summary of my master's dissertation work. For my MSc in Coaching and Behavioural Change, which I did from Henley Business School, I did my dissertation research on hybrid happiness. Can knowledge workers be happier in the hybrid world through the psychological flow cycle? I picked up the topic of psychological flow because this is something that's always fascinated me. You might have heard of the American-Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who said that the happiest people spend much time in the state of flow, the state where they're so involved in their activity that nothing else matters. I had experienced this state as a dancer, but I know I've also been in flow at work. It fascinates me. I already knew from previous research that flow is directly related to happiness, to well-being, and to performance. But when I started reading more about it, I realized there wasn't sufficient research about flow in the context of knowledge workers. Knowledge workers being people who use their knowledge in order to earn their living. And this was particularly true of knowledge workers in the hybrid world post-COVID, where hybrid was becoming a way of life. What is flow? So Csikszentmihalyi had identified 9 core components of flow. Nowadays, it's been evolved and evolved, and there are about 24 or 25 core components that I've heard of. But these 9, I think, really summarize it really well. So basically, whatever that activity is, there needs to be the right balance of challenge and skill. If it's too challenging, you'll have burnout, and if it's not challenging enough, you will be bored. So you have to have the right balance, which is that the challenge needs to be just slightly more than your skill, so it keeps you poised always. The next thing is it needs to have clear goals, and there needs to be immediate feedback. Another important characteristic of flow is that the individual needs to be having total focus or intense concentration on the activity itself. So much such that the action and awareness just become one and the same. You become part of the activity yourself. You have an amazing sense of control, and there is distortion of time. So time can seem longer in some cases or shorter in some cases, but basically there's distortion of time. Another really important characteristic of flow is loss of self-consciousness. It switches off the part of your brain which has the critical side. So therefore, there is loss of self-consciousness, and therefore you will try more things. And finally, the most important thing, which I represent by a circle of meaning, is there is something about it intrinsically meaning something to you. So you have to enjoy the activity itself, and that's what flow is all about. You can get flow through all sorts of activities, for example, gambling. But if I add a circle of meaning, it basically means that we are looking at flow through activities that have some meaning in our lives, which are connected to our values. So how did I go about it? If you were one of my research participants, a big thank you once again for participating in this research. I reached out to 12 individuals from my network who are all very kind and very generous with their time. They were all knowledge workers, worked in the hybrid environment, and I had a real range of roles in there. So from CEOs, personal assistants, heads of HR, heads of IT, and there were analysts. So it was a complete range and a lot of demographics as well in there. And what did they have to do? So they had to keep a diary log, and the diary log was about their experience at work in the week, including when did they take breaks, what kind of breaks did they take, etc. And then we had an interview, which was what I'd call a semi-structured interview. So it was broadly to get into more detail about them talking about their experiences. And then I analyzed it qualitatively because it's rich data and used a methodology which you can see in this picture out here, and it's called reflexive thematic analysis. Basically, it's about being quite reflexive with your thinking and going around in a circle and evolving your thinking time and again, and when you say reflexive, it's more than just reflective, which is when you're thinking about things, but reflexive is about you're putting yourself, so me as the researcher, I'm making specific meaning of things. So I'm putting myself in the middle of it as well. So it's all about familiarizing data, coding, which is a big part of qualitative analysis, coming up with initial themes, developing these themes. And you can see from this diagram, there were various methodologies that were used in order to do this. And what did I actually find from all this research? So what I found, what I already knew, was that flow was a cycle, and it became more obvious with the research that the cycle often starts with the struggle. It then goes to release. Basically, the struggle is where the challenge skill balance, you're just settling down into it, and then the releases, you just need a little bit of a break from that activity, and then you can come back and get straight into flow. But then the most important bit is you need to have time for recovery. Flow has a high neural load. There is a lot of your endorphins, a lot of hormones that are active in your brain. There is a lot of neural load on the brain. So it's important that there is enough time for recovery, and that recovery is active recovery. So for example, if you're scrolling the phone or watching TV, that may be fine once in a while, but that might not be active recovery. You might need to really switch your brain off into a quieter, different mode. For example, going for a walk, going for a run, having a bath, and things like that, which make a real difference. So the themes that came up for hybrid workers, there were three of them. The first one is, let's start at the very beginning. Let's start with reflecting, planning, and making meaning of the work that we are doing. Now, it's really interesting when you think about athletes and artists who, athletes particularly, who are a big candidate for flow research previously, you'll see that they are actually really good at planning their day. They plan for their work, they for for their training, they plan for their well-being as well. Whereas hybrid knowledge workers are not really trained to do this, and they're not incentivized to do it either. So reflecting, and people don't reflect, and this is something that everybody acknowledge, but it's actually really useful when you do. So reflecting at the start, making meaning of how are you adding value to that work, and what do you need to do, really makes a difference. The second theme, which is really important, is you can't actually create flow. Flow is like happiness. You can't create it. You can create conditions for it, and then flow has to ensue. So it's what are those conditions that you can create, and how can you create them? And then the third theme was about the balance. So we talked about recovery. It's really important that flow is balanced with recovery, and you're giving your brain a break. You're making sure that that neural load is not burning out your brain, and you have a bit of a break, and it's an active break, which really helps you. So using this research, I've come up with this model. It's a fairly simple model, but something that hybrid knowledge workers can use in order to actually create the right conditions for flow. So it starts with the first circle, which is about purposeful reflection. So this is where I invite you to be really clear about your values and what's important to you in life. And then you start planning for both work and well-being. So let's start with work. There are 5 considerations that I invite you to look at when you're planning for work. So the first one is your unique value add. So everyone, whatever their role is, has a unique value add to the work that they're doing. The important thing is to identify what that is, and then being able to make sure you're spending enough time in that value add space. The next bit is about the challenge skill balance. So how do you make sure that the challenge of your work, you're actually skilled enough to do it? And if it's not challenging enough, how can you make it more challenging? So it's both ways. But it's really important to see that you've got the right resources, the right training, and the right mentoring or coaching to be able to do the work if it's more challenging than you think you have the skills for, and if it's less challenging, then actually actively seeking out ways to make it more challenging or add to your work in some ways. The next one is distraction management. This is easier said than done. This is about how do you make sure that you're not being distracted by the constant flurry of emails, constant flurry of messages, and social media and everything else. When you're focusing on a task, what can you do? How can you use the IT to actually switch off notifications and actually keep the phone away from you if possible? That brings us to the right environment. what is the right environment for that piece of work? One of the participants talked about how they actually went for a walk and they found thinking when they were walking outdoors was a great way to really come up with some good ideas. So what's the right environment for the work that you're doing? As hybrid knowledge workers, also thinking about, should you be doing it at home or should you be doing it at work? So there are certain tasks that you might want to plan in such a way that when you're going into the office, you could plan it then. And there are other tasks which you might want to do only when you're working from home or working from a cafe or somewhere else. And then the last bit is about synchronicity. It's how do you make sure that the work is right in terms of synchronicity? What I mean by that is, does it need to be synchronous? That do you need to be working on it in that point in time? Or could you ask the other person to look at it asynchronously? For example, there's a piece of information. That information can go to somebody in a in a readable format or a visual format like a video or an audio, which they can read or hear at their own convenience. So it's being clear on what's important to be synchronous and what isn't in terms of your work. So it's looking at your work week and planning it against all those functions. Then planning for your well-being. This is something that we don't do very well as hybrid knowledge workers. I'm of course generalizing, but that's what I got from the research that I've seen so far. Are you planning for your sleep and your nutrition? Do you make sure you have enough time? Are you able to wind down and sleep at the right time, get up at the right time so you are well rested? Are you having the right things around in the house so that you're eating the right things and not just snacking on biscuits or stuff that's not good for you? What kind of movement are you incorporating in your life? And the Harvard Business School had written a great article about how exercise is really important for performance and well-being, and what kind of movement are you incorporating? Circadian rhythm. Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? How can you use that to take your most challenging activities and doing it at the time that you are at your best? The right environment. If you're taking a break, where should that break be? This is your well-being. Do you need some fresh air periodically? Do you need to do stuff? I mean, if you're sitting and watching something, is there enough light coming in? What do you need to do? So thinking about that. And then the last bit is thinking about the quality of your breaks. Are you recovering actively? Are you actually allowing your brains to switch off? So using this model, I hope you could actually create the conditions for flow. I hope you do get to experience flow, and I would love to do more research on this, so watch this space. Thank you.